The courtroom was quiet except for the faint hum of whispers that echoed off the wooden walls. People sat stiffly in their seats, some clutching folders or notebooks, others nervously tapping their feet against the cold floor. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a scent that seemed to linger permanently in places like this. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, her dark hair tied neatly into a bun, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if searching for answers no one else could see. Karoline was not new to courtrooms. She had spent years building her career, fighting cases that most lawyers avoided because they were too complicated or too risky. But today felt different. Today, she wasn't just representing herself, she was standing up for an entire community, a group of small-town residents who had been poisoned by toxic waste, dumped illegally by a powerful corporation. These people depended on her, trusted her to give them a voice when no one else would. Listen. And Karoline didn't take that responsibility lightly. Across the bench sat Judge Harold Grayson, a man whose stern expression rarely changed regardless of what unfolded before him. He was tall and thin, with silver hair combed back so precisely it looked almost unnatural. His deep-set eyes scanned the room without interest, as though he were merely waiting for the day's proceedings to end so he could move on to something more important. To many, Judge Grayson appeared intimidating, even admirable in his authority. But those who knew him well understood there was another side to him, one marked by arrogance and impatience. As Karoline began laying out her case, she spoke clearly and confidently, each word chosen carefully to make her point. She explained how the corporation, Apex Industries, had knowingly violated environmental laws by dumping hazardous chemicals near the town's water supply. She described the devastating effects this had on the residents, children falling ill, crops failing, families losing everything they had worked for. Her voice carried emotion, but it was controlled, professional. This was her moment to shine, to prove once again why she was considered one of the best in her field. But Judge Grayson wasn't listening. Or rather, he didn't seem to care. Within minutes of Karoline starting her presentation, he leaned forward in his chair, interrupting her with a wave of his hand. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "can we please stick to the facts? Your dramatic storytelling isn't helping anyone here." Karoline paused mid-sentence, her jaw tightening slightly. She glanced at the judge, then back down at her notes, taking a deep breath before continuing. She reminded herself that this wasn't about her pride. It was about the people counting on her. Still, the interruption stung. It was disrespectful, dismissive, and entirely unnecessary. Yet she pressed on, determined not to let him derail her. Every few minutes, Judge Grayson found another reason to cut her off. Sometimes it was a question, about a minor detail. Other times it was a sarcastic remark disguised as feedback. "Are you sure you're prepared for this case?" he asked at one point, raising an eyebrow as if daring her to respond. "It seems like you might be in over your head." The comment drew murmurs from the audience, some of whom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even opposing counsel, a slick-talking lawyer named Richard Hayes, looked surprised by the judge's behavior. Normally, judges maintained a level of impartiality, allowing both sides to present their arguments without interference. But Judge Grayson seemed intent on making things difficult for Karoline, and everyone could see it. Despite his constant interruptions, Karoline refused to lose her composure. She answered each question calmly, providing concise explanations whenever possible. When the judge accused her of being overly emotional, she simply smiled and said, "I assure you, Your Honor, my statements are based on evidence, not emotions." Her response earned a few nods of approval from the spectators, but Judge Grayson only scowled. As the morning wore on, the tension in the room grew thicker. Karoline's hands gripped the edge of the podium tightly, her knuckles turning white. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but it was becoming harder to ignore the growing sense of frustration bubbling inside her. Every time she opened her mouth to speak, Judge Grayson found a way to shut her down. It was as if he didn't want her to succeed, not because of the case itself, but because she was challenging the status quo. Sitting in the front row of the gallery was Pam Bondi, a seasoned prosecutor who had decided to observe the trial out of curiosity. Pam had heard rumors about Judge Grayson's reputation, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. She watched as Karoline struggled to get through her opening statement, her frustration evident despite her best efforts to hide it. Pam couldn't help but feel sympathy for the young lawyer. She knew how hard it was to navigate a system that often favored those with power and influence, especially when facing someone like Grayson. When the judge finally called for a short recess, Pam approached Karoline in the hallway outside the courtroom. "That was quite a show in there," Pam said, offering a sympathetic smile. "You handled yourself well considering the circumstances." Karoline sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Thanks, I guess. Though I'm not sure well is the right word. He barely let me finish 2 sentences. Pam nodded, her expression turning serious. "I've seen this kind of behavior before. Judges like Grayson think they can intimidate lawyers into submission. They thrive on keeping people off balance." Karoline frowned. "But why? What does he have to gain by treating me like that?" Pam hesitated for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Let's just say Judge Grayson isn't exactly known for playing by the rules. There are concerns about his conduct in certain cases. If you're interested, I might be able to share more later." Karoline raised an eyebrow, intrigued but wary. "What kind of concerns?" Before Pam could answer, the bailiff announced that the recess was over, and they returned to the courtroom. As they took their seats, Karoline couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on beneath the surface. Whatever Pam Bondi knew, it was clear that Judge Grayson's actions weren't random. There was a pattern here, one that Karoline intended to uncover. Back inside, Judge Grayson resumed his role as the gatekeeper of chaos. He continued to interrupt Karoline at every turn, his comments growing increasingly harsh. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as if bored. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice laced with disdain, "perhaps you should consider pursuing a different line of work. Clearly, litigation isn't your forte." The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Even Richard Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. For a judge to speak to a lawyer like that in open court was unprecedented, almost shocking. It was unprofessional, unethical, and completely unacceptable. Karoline froze for a split second, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on her, waiting to see how she would react. Slowly, she straightened her posture, meeting Judge Grayson's gaze with unwavering determination. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said evenly, "my job is to represent my clients to the best of my ability, and I intend to do just that." Her words hung in the air, bold and defiant. For a moment, it seemed like Judge Grayson might retaliate further, but instead, he simply waved her off. "Proceed, Miss Leavitt," he muttered, clearly annoyed that she hadn't backed down. As Karoline continued her argument, she couldn't help but notice Pam Bondi watching intently from the sidelines. There was something in Pam's expression, a mixture of admiration and resolve, that gave Karoline hope. Whatever battle lay ahead, she wouldn't have to face it alone. By the time the morning session ended, Karoline felt drained but oddly empowered. Judge Grayson's disrespect had been infuriating, yes, but it had also lit a fire within her, realized now that this case wasn't just about holding Apex Industries accountable. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that allowed people like Grayson to abuse their power. And Karoline was ready to fight for justice, no matter what. Obstacles stood in her way. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet, save for the soft murmur of voices and the occasional echo of footsteps against the tiled floor. Karoline leaned against the wall, her arms crossed as she tried to steady her breathing. The confrontation with Judge Grayson had left her rattled, though she refused to let it show. She stared at the ground, replaying his words in her mind, his dismissive tone, his cutting remarks. It wasn't just about her. It was about undermining her clients, silencing their voices before they even had a chance to be heard. Pam Bondi stood nearby, watching Karoline closely. There was something about the younger lawyer that intrigued Pam. Despite the judge's blatant disrespect, Karoline hadn't crumbled. Instead, She had stood her ground, her composure unshaken. That kind of resilience was rare, especially in someone so early in their career. Pam decided it was time to share what she knew. "Karoline," Pam said gently, stepping closer. "Can we talk for a moment?" Karoline looked up, her expression guarded but curious. "Sure," she replied, pushing herself off the wall. "What's on your mind?" Pam glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot, then lowered her voice. "I mentioned earlier that there are concerns about Judge Grayson. Well, it's more than just rumors. I've been investigating him for months now. He's involved in some serious misconduct." Karoline's eyes widened slightly. "Misconduct? Like what?" Pam hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's complicated, but here's the short version. There's evidence suggesting Grayson has accepted bribes from powerful corporations to sway rulings in their favor. Apex Industries, the same company you're fighting in this case, is one of them." For a moment, Karoline didn't say anything. Her mind raced, piecing together the implications. If what Pam was saying was true, it explained a lot. Grayson's hostility toward her, his eagerness to shut her down at every turn. But it also meant the deck was stacked far higher against her than she'd realized. "Why are you telling me this?" Karoline asked finally, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Because I think you can help," Pam replied. "You're already in the middle of this fight, whether you like it or not. And if we play our cards right, we might be able to expose Grayson for who he really is. But it won't be easy." Karoline nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what Pam was asking. She had always believed in justice, in fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But taking on a corrupt judge? That was a whole new level of danger. Still, she couldn't walk away, not when so much was at stake. "What do you need from me?" Karoline asked, her voice firm. Pam smiled faintly, impressed by the younger woman's determination. "First, we need to gather more evidence. What happened in there today, that scene with Grayson, it's not enough on its own. But if we can prove a pattern of behavior, connect it to the bribery allegations, we might have a shot at bringing him down." As they spoke, the courtroom doors opened, and people began filing back inside. The recess was over, and the trial would resume shortly. Pam placed a reassuring hand on Karoline's shoulder. "Don't worry about everything right now. Focus on your case. Let me handle the rest. Just know that you're not alone in this." Karoline gave a small nod, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the tension. She returned to the courtroom, her step steadier than before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she now had an ally, one who understood the system and wasn't afraid to challenge it. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Grayson resumed his seat, his demeanor unchanged. He acted as though nothing unusual had occurred during the recess, as if his earlier comments had been perfectly acceptable. Karoline took her place at the podium, her notes spread out before her. She glanced briefly at Pam, who gave her an encouraging nod from the gallery. When the session resumed, Karoline continued presenting her case. This time, however, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Some members of the audience seemed more attentive, leaning forward in their seats as if sensing that something bigger was unfolding. Even Richard Hayes, the opposing counsel, appeared uneasy, his usual confidence faltering under the weight of uncertainty. Judge Grayson, oblivious to the growing suspicion surrounding him, remained as abrasive as ever. He interrupted Karoline repeatedly, dismissing her arguments with thinly veiled contempt, but Karoline no longer reacted to his provocations. She had learned to anticipate them, to sidestep his attempts to throw her off balance. Each time he cut her off, she simply paused, waited for him to finish, and then calmly continued where she had left off. Her composure only served to irritate Grayson further. By mid-afternoon, his patience had worn thin. "Miss Leavitt," he snapped, slamming his gavel down for emphasis. "Must I remind you again that this is a court of law, not a stage for your theatrics?" The comment drew audible gasps from the crowd, followed by murmurs of disapproval. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the judge with unease. Karoline, however, remained unfazed. She met Grayson's glare with a steady gaze, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor," she said, "if my presentation is theatrical, it's only because the truth deserves to be heard. My clients' lives depend on it." Her words resonated throughout the room, earning nods of agreement from several spectators. For the first time, Grayson seemed taken aback, his mask of authority slipping ever so slightly. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the courtroom doors burst open. Everyone turned to see federal agents entering, their presence commanding immediate attention. At the front of the group was a tall man in a dark suit, his badge clearly visible as he approached the bench. Behind him trailed two officers holding documents and electronic devices. "Judge Harold Grayson," the lead agent announced, his voice ringing out across the silent room. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of corruption, including accepting bribes and obstructing justice." The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. People rose from their seats, craning their necks to get a better view. Judge Grayson's face turned pale, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as if trying to steady himself. "This is absurd," he sputtered, his voice trembling with indignation. "Who authorized this?" The agent ignored his protests, reading him his rights as the officers moved in to restrain him. Grayson struggled briefly, shouting accusations and denials, but his efforts were futile. Within moments, he was being led away in handcuffs, his once imposing figure reduced to that of a defeated man. As the chaos unfolded, Pam Bondi stepped forward, addressing the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and authoritative, "this arrest is the result of an ongoing investigation into systemic corruption within our judicial system. We have uncovered substantial evidence linking Judge Grayson to illegal activities, including financial transactions with Apex Industries. Rest assured, this matter will be thoroughly pursued, and all guilty parties will be held accountable." Her words brought a sense of relief to many in the room, particularly the residents of the small town represented by Karoline. They clapped and cheered, their faith in justice momentarily restored. Carolina watched silently, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and a lingering anger over the abuse of power she had witnessed. Once the initial commotion subsided, Pam approached Karoline, her expression serious but hopeful. "This isn't over yet," she said quietly. "There's still a lot of work to do. But today we took a big step toward fixing what's broken." Karoline nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. "I won't let you or my clients down." Pam smiled faintly. "I know you won't." Later that evening, after the courtroom had emptied, and the day's events had begun to sink in, Karoline sat alone in her office. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the gentle hum of her desk lamp. She stared at the stack of files in front of her, each one filled with evidence and testimonies collected over months of hard work. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Exposing Judge Grayson was just the beginning. There were still powerful forces working against her clients. But for now, she took solace in knowing that she wasn't fighting alone, with allies like Pam Bondi by her side, and the courage of the people she represented fueling her determination. Karoline felt ready to face whatever came next. She picked up her pen and began reviewing the documents, her mind focused on the task ahead. Justice might be a long and difficult journey, but Karoline Leavitt was prepared to see it through, to the very end. The days following Judge Grayson's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. News of the scandal spread quickly, dominating headlines across the country. Reporters camped outside courthouses and corporate offices, eager to uncover every detail of the unfolding drama. For Karoline Leavitt, the sudden spotlight was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She had spent years working quietly behind the scenes, focusing on her clients and their needs. Now, she found herself at the center of a national conversation about corruption, accountability, and justice. Pam Bondi became a constant presence in Karoline's life during this time. Together, they worked tirelessly to ensure that the investigation into Grayson's misconduct continued without interruption. Pam brought decades of experience to the table, guiding Karoline through the complexities of navigating public scrutiny while maintaining the integrity of the case. "This is bigger than just one judge," Pam reminded her often. "If we're going to fix the system, we need to expose everything." Karoline understood the weight of what they were trying to achieve. With Grayson removed from the bench, the toxic waste case resumed under a new judge, Laura Bennett, a respected figure known for her fairness and dedication to justice. Judge Bennett wasted no time in setting a tone of professionalism and respect in her courtroom. From the moment she took over, it was clear that she intended to give both sides an equal opportunity to present their arguments. For Karoline, this shift was a relief. Under Judge Bennett's guidance, she was finally able to lay out her case fully and without constant interruptions. She presented evidence meticulously gathered over months of research, internal company emails revealing deliberate violations of environmental laws, expert testimonies linking the toxic waste to health issues among residents, and financial records showing how Apex Industries prioritized profits over safety. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of corporate greed and negligence. Opposing counsel Richard Hayes struggled to counter Karoline's arguments. Without Grayson's biased rulings to rely on, Hayes found himself on shaky ground. His attempts to discredit the evidence fell flat, undermined by the sheer volume of documentation Karoline provided. Even his polished demeanor seemed less effective when faced with the raw truth of the harm caused by Apex Industries. As the trial progressed, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted noticeably. Spectators who had initially been skeptical of Karoline's claims began nodding along as she spoke, visibly moved by the stories of suffering shared by the victims. Some residents even took the stand themselves, recounting how their lives had been upended by the contamination. A farmer named William Carter described how his crops had failed year after year, leaving him unable to support his family. A young mother named Lisa Harper tearfully recounted watching her child battle chronic illnesses linked to polluted water. Their testimonies humanized the case, making it impossible to ignore the real-world consequences of Apex's actions. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi worked behind the scenes to gather additional evidence against Judge Grayson and others implicated in the corruption scandal. One of her key breakthroughs came when a former court clerk named Daniel Harper agreed to cooperate with investigators. Daniel had worked closely with Grayson for years and had witnessed firsthand how the judge manipulated cases to benefit certain corporations. In exchange for immunity, he provided detailed accounts of Grayson's dealings with Apex Industries, including secret meetings and undisclosed payments. Daniel's testimony added fuel to the fire, giving prosecutors the leverage they needed to pursue charges not only against Grayson, but also against several high-ranking executives at Apex. More details emerged. Public outrage grew. Protesters gathered outside Apex headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for our town" and "Stop corporate greed." Social media campaigns amplified their message, drawing attention from activists and lawmakers alike. Back in the courtroom, Karoline felt a renewed sense of purpose. The support from the community and from Pam gave her strength to push forward despite the challenges. Still, there were moments when the pressure threatened to overwhelm her. Late nights spent reviewing documents, early mornings preparing for cross-examinations, and endless phone calls with clients left her physically and emotionally drained. But whenever doubt crept in, she reminded herself why she had chosen this path in the first place: to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Karoline met Pam at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. They sat at a corner table sipping coffee as they discussed the latest developments in the case. Pam could see the fatigue etched on Karoline's face, but also noticed the spark of determination in her eyes. "You're doing incredible work, Karoline," Pam said, leaning forward slightly. "Don't forget to take care of yourself, though. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon." Karoline smiled faintly, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I know, it's just, sometimes it feels like the weight of the world is on my shoulders. These people are counting on me and I can't let them down." "And you won't," Pam replied firmly. "But remember, you don't have to carry this burden alone. We're in this together." Their conversation turned to strategy as they mapped out the final stages of the trial. With the prosecution's case nearly complete, The defense would soon have its turn to present witnesses and arguments. Karoline knew Hayes would pull out all the stops to cast doubt on her evidence, so she and Pam spent hours anticipating potential counter-arguments and preparing rebuttals. When the trial reconvened the next morning, Hayes called his first witness, a scientist hired by Apex to dispute the link between the toxic waste and the residents' health problems. The scientist, Dr. Alan Meyer, spoke confidently, citing studies and data that appeared to contradict Karoline's claims. But Karoline was ready. During cross-examination, she methodically dismantled his testimony, pointing out flaws in his methodology and highlighting conflicts of interest tied to his funding sources. By the end of the day, Dr. Meyer's credibility was in tatters. The jury exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed by his evasive answers and lack of transparency. Hayes looked increasingly agitated, realizing that his carefully constructed defense was crumbling under Karoline's relentless questioning. As the trial entered its final phase, the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. Closing arguments loomed, and both sides prepared to make their last appeals to the jury. Karoline spent hours refining her speech, determined to leave a lasting impression. She wanted to remind the jurors not just of the facts, but of the human cost of Apex's actions, the families torn apart, the futures stolen, the trust betrayed. On the morning of closing arguments, the courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and reporters lined the walls, cameras poised to capture the moment. When it was Karoline's turn to speak, she stood slowly, taking a deep breath before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and clear. "This case is about more than just money or legal technicalities. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that powerful corporations cannot act with impunity, poisoning our land and endanger buildings our future. These people, our neighbors, our friends, deserve justice. They deserve to know that their voices matter, that their pain will not be ignored." Her words resonated deeply, earning nods of agreement from the jury and murmurs of approval from the audience. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, a rare occurrence in a courtroom setting. Even Judge Bennett allowed a small smile, acknowledging the impact of Karoline's impassioned plea. As the jury retired to deliberate, Karoline stepped outside for some fresh air. The crisp breeze helped clear her mind, offering a brief respite from the intensity of the past few weeks. Pam joined her shortly afterward, bringing news that investigators had uncovered yet another layer of corruption involving Apex Industries. It seemed the deeper they dug, the more widespread the rot became. Despite the mounting evidence, Karoline knew the fight wasn't over. Convincing a jury to rule in favor of her clients was one thing, dismantling the systemic issues that allowed such injustices to occur in the first place was another challenge entirely. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, grateful for the progress they had made, and hopeful for what lay ahead. The jury deliberations stretched on longer than anyone expected. Hours turned into days, and the tension in the courthouse grew thicker with each passing moment. Reporters continued to camp outside, their cameras trained on the entrance, waiting for any sign of movement. Inside, Karoline Leavitt paced nervously in a small conference room, her mind racing with possibilities. She had done everything she could, presented the evidence, cross-examined witnesses, delivered a powerful closing argument, but now the decision rested in the hands of 12 strangers. Pam Bondi sat nearby, scrolling through documents on her tablet while keeping one eye on Karoline. "You've done all you can," Pam said gently, breaking the silence. "Now it's out of your hands." Karoline stopped pacing and sank into a chair across from Pam. "I know," she replied, rubbing her temples. "But it's hard not to think about every possible outcome. What if they side with Apex? What if they don't see the truth?" Pam set her tablet aside and leaned forward. "They will. You gave them no choice but to see it. The evidence is overwhelming, and your closing argument was perfect. Trust me, I've been in enough trials to recognize when justice is on our side." Her words offered some comfort, but Karoline couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at her. This case wasn't just about winning or losing. It represented something much bigger, a chance to hold powerful corporations accountable and restore faith in a broken system. If the jury ruled against her clients, it would send a message that greed and corruption could prevail over fairness and integrity. Finally, on the third day of deliberations, the court clerk announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The news spread quickly, drawing a crowd back into the courtroom. Spectators filled the benches, many clutching tissues or holding hands for support. The residents of the small town sat together, their faces etched with hope and fear. Even Richard Hayes seemed uneasy as he took his seat, flipping through papers without really looking at them. When the jury filed in, Karoline felt her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Judge Bennett, who nodded encouragingly before instructing the foreperson to deliver the verdict. The foreperson stood gripping a slip of paper tightly. "We the jury find in favor of the plaintiffs," she announced, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We award damages, totaling $15 million to be paid by Apex Industries to the affected families." The room erupted into cheers and applause. Some residents cried openly, hugging one another as relief washed over them. Karoline exhaled deeply, tears welling up in her eyes. It was over. They had won. Justice had been served. Judge Bennett banged her gavel to restore order, though her expression revealed a hint of satisfaction. "This court acknowledges the jury's decision," she said firmly. "Apex Industries is hereby ordered to comply with this ruling immediately." As the formalities concluded, reporters swarmed Karoline and Pam, eager for statements. Karoline stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "Today's verdict sends a clear message. No corporation is above the law. These families fought tirelessly for justice, and I'm proud to have stood alongside them. This victory belongs to them, and to everyone who believes in accountability and fairness." Her words resonated far beyond the courtroom. Across the country, people celebrated the outcome as a triumph against corporate greed. Activists hailed it as a turning point, proof that ordinary citizens could take on powerful entities and win. For the residents of the small town, the ruling meant more than just financial compensation. It meant vindication, closure, and the promise of a better future. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial continued to unfold. Federal authorities expanded their investigation into Apex Industries, uncovering even deeper layers of misconduct. Executives were subpoenaed to testify before Congress, while internal documents revealed widespread environmental violations spanning decades. Public outrage grew louder, leading to calls for stricter regulations and oversight. For Judge Harold Grayson, the consequences were severe. His trial for corruption charges began shortly after the toxic waste case concluded. Witnesses like Daniel Harper provided damning testimonies, detailing how Grayson had manipulated rulings in exchange for bribes. Prosecutors presented bank records showing large sums of money transferred from Apex Industries to offshore accounts linked to Grayson. By the time the trial ended, Grayson was convicted on multiple counts of bribery, fraud, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a stark reminder that no one, not even a judge, was immune to accountability. Meanwhile, Karoline found herself thrust into the national spotlight. Media outlets profiled her as a rising star in the legal world, praising her tenacity and dedication to justice. Invitations poured in for speaking engagements, interviews, and award ceremonies. While flattered, Karoline remained focused on her work. She knew the attention wouldn't last forever, and she didn't want to lose sight of what mattered most: helping those in need. Pam Bondi played a crucial role during this period, mentoring Karoline as she navigated her newfound fame. "Use this platform wisely," Pam advised during one of their meetings. "People are listening now. You have an opportunity to push for real change." Inspired by Pam's guidance, Karoline began advocating for reforms within the judicial system. She collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency and reducing the influence of money in courtrooms. She also founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting communities affected by corporate misconduct, providing resources and legal assistance to those seeking justice. Despite her success, Karoline never forgot where she came from. She returned frequently to the small town that had inspired her fight, checking in on the families she had represented. Many of them used the settlement funds to rebuild their lives, repairing homes, starting businesses, and sending children to college. Seeing their progress filled Karoline with pride, reinforcing her belief in the power of resilience and unity. One evening, as autumn leaves swirled outside her office window, Karoline reflected on how far she had come. The past few months had been a whirlwind of challenges and victories, highs and lows, but through it all she had stayed true to her values, refusing to compromise her principles even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Pam, carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Thought you could use a little celebration," Pam said with a smile. Karoline laughed softly, gesturing for her to come in. "That sounds perfect." They sat together, sipping wine and reminiscing about the journey they had shared. Pam raised her glass in a toast. To justice, and to never backing down. "To justice," Karoline echoed, clinking her glass against Pam's. "And to the people who make it possible." As they talked late into the night, Karoline felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the victory but for the lessons she had learned along the way. She realized now that justice wasn't just about winning cases. It was about building trust, fostering hope, and inspiring others to stand up for what was right. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, Karoline felt ready to face them. With allies like Pam by her side and the courage of countless individuals fueling her resolve, she knew she could continue fighting for a fairer, more just world, one step at a time. Months had passed since the landmark verdict in the toxic waste case, and life had begun to settle into a new rhythm for Karoline Leavitt. The whirlwind of media attention had slowed, though her name still carried weight in legal circles and among activists working for reform. For Karoline, however, the real reward wasn't the recognition. It was seeing the tangible changes brought about by their collective efforts. The small town she had fought so hard to protect was slowly healing, its residents rebuilding their lives with the compensation they had received. But Karoline knew this was only one chapter in a much larger story. One crisp morning, Karoline stood outside a community center in the heart of the town. Inside, volunteers were setting up tables and chairs for an event organized by her nonprofit organization. The gathering would bring together local leaders, activists, and residents to discuss ways to prevent similar disasters in the future. It was part of Karoline's ongoing mission to ensure that no other community would suffer as this one had. As she walked through the doors, she was greeted warmly by familiar faces, people she had come to know during the trial. William Carter, the farmer whose crops had failed due to contaminated water, approached her with a smile. "Karoline, thank you again for everything," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "We couldn't have done it without you." Karoline returned the gesture, her expression softening. "It was your courage that made all the difference, William. I just helped give you a voice." Her humility earned nods of agreement from others nearby. These interactions reminded her why she had chosen this path: to empower those who felt powerless, to amplify voices often ignored. And while the scars left by Apex Industries' actions might never fully fade, there was hope in the air now, a sense that brighter days lay ahead. Later that afternoon, Pam Bondi arrived at the community center. She had driven in from out of Fonder town to attend the event, eager to see firsthand the impact of Karoline's work. As they hugged briefly, Pam remarked, "This place looks incredible. You've really built something special here." "It's not just me," Karoline replied, modestly. "Everyone pitched in. The residents, the volunteers, even some former colleagues. It's a team effort." Pam smiled knowingly. "Still deflecting credit, I see. Well, don't let me stop you from doing what you do best. Let's get started." Event began with speeches from several speakers, including local leaders and environmental advocates. Karoline took the stage last, her presence commanding immediate attention. She spoke passionately about the importance of vigilance and accountability, urging everyone to remain proactive in safeguarding their communities. "Justice isn't something we achieve once and then forget about," she said. "It's a constant process, one that requires all of us to stay informed, engaged, and united." Her words resonated deeply with the audience, earning enthusiastic applause. Afterward, attendees broke into smaller groups to brainstorm ideas for long-term solutions. Some discussed strategies for monitoring corporate activity, while others explored ways to educate young people about environmental stewardship. The energy in the room was electric, fueled by a shared determination to create lasting change. As the day wound down, Karoline found herself sitting alone on a bench outside the community center, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky blazed with hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the quiet streets. Pam joined her moments later, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Here," Pam said, handing one to Karoline. "You look like you could use a break." Karoline accepted, the cup gratefully, taking a sip before responding. "Thanks. Today was amazing. Seeing everyone come together like that reminded me why this fight is worth it." Pam nodded thoughtfully. "You've inspired a lot of people, you know. Not just here, but across the country. People are starting to believe that change is possible, that justice can prevail if we stand firm." Karoline sighed, leaning back against the bench. "I wish it didn't take so much effort, though. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever reach a point where corporations and governments prioritize people over profit." "We might not get there in our lifetime," Pam admitted. "But every step forward counts. Look how far we've come already." Grayson's conviction sent shockwaves through the system. Apex Industries is facing stricter regulations because of what happened here. Those are victories, Karoline. Small ones, maybe, but victories nonetheless. Karoline nodded slowly, absorbing Pam's words. She realized that progress didn't always happen in grand leaps. Sometimes it came in steady, incremental steps. Each victory, no matter how minor, paved the way for greater change. Their conversation turned to the future. Pam mentioned plans to expand her own advocacy work, focusing on systemic reforms within the judicial system. "There's still so much corruption lurking beneath the surface," she explained. "We need to keep shining a light on it, exposing it wherever we find it." Karoline agreed wholeheartedly. "And I want to keep supporting communities like this one. If we can help them prepare for challenges before they arise, maybe we can prevent disasters like this from happening again." They talked late into the evening, sharing ideas and dreaming of a better tomorrow. When Pam finally rose to leave, she gave Karoline a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Keep doing what you're doing, okay? The world needs more people like you." "I will," Karoline promised. "And thank you for everything. I couldn't have done it without you." Pam smiled warmly before heading to her car, leaving Karoline alone with her thoughts. As darkness settled over the town, she gazed up at the stars scattered across the night sky. They seemed endless, infinite, a reminder of how vast the universe truly was. Yet amidst that vastness, she felt a profound connection to the people around her, bound together by a shared commitment to justice and fairness. In the weeks that followed, Karoline threw herself into her work with renewed vigor. Her nonprofit organization grew rapidly, attracting volunteers and donors from across the nation. Together, they launched educational campaigns, lobbied for policy changes, and provided resources to communities facing similar threats. Through it all, Karoline remained grounded, drawing strength from the relationships she had forged along the way. One evening, as she reviewed documents in her office, Karoline paused to glance at a photograph pinned to the wall. It showed her standing alongside the residents of the small town on the day of the verdict, their faces radiant with joy. The image served as a powerful reminder of what was possible when people came together to fight for what was right. Karoline leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. There had been moments of doubt, times when the odds seemed insurmountable. But through perseverance and teamwork, she had overcome obstacles she once thought impossible. More importantly, she had learned that justice wasn't just about winning battles. It was about building bridges, fostering trust, and creating a world where everyone had a fair chance to thrive. With a satisfied smile, Karoline turned off her desk lamp and gathered her belongings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be.